Well, because like,
we don't have
hold
to.
on. Well, there are, because this is another issue that I have. I hate this guy so much. Thank you for reminding me why I hate this guy so much. Things that he's saying are so broad that there are worlds where what he's saying could be so horrible. Like, wow, this is a big problem. Or things where what he's
Destiny engaged with a debate with this guy named P.F. Young. I don't know that debate is the right word. Destiny just kind of tore him apart. In this section of their conversation, P.F. Young was saying that he really likes Vivek Ramaswamy, and Destiny just kind of went off on him. So we're going to take a look at clips from Destiny's stream. I will share my thoughts on this as well. This one's pretty entertaining. Let's get into it.
like big of a
fair enough.
I think that things like immigration and the economy and inflation, like stuff like this, were driving the American conversation more. But I could be wrong. Maybe I'm in different parts. But
I'm not even saying that it was bigger than the economy, but I do think it was a bigger part. But I have no evidence. It's all vibes based. That's fair.
Okay.
I love Vivek Ramaswamy. I've listened to him a bunch. I've never heard him say anything that was incredibly stupid.
Okay.
Should I have a different opinion than I do?
I don't.
I think you said what? This was a while back. Again, I don't have evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But you said something like, the litmus test for determining whether or not someone is a moron is whether they like Vivek Ramaswamy. And I was like,
was it Vivek or was it RFK? It might have been Vivek too. Vivek to me just seemed like he was just an empty populist. He comes up and he says things that sound good, but there's like no empirical backing. There's no like historical backing. It just says things that sounds good, and that's it.
Well, that's sort of how I evaluate what you do. Is like, you sound good on a lot of things, and then I say, well, he's probably right on things. I mean, I guess like.
Well, what do you think? Like, give me what's a solid policy proposal from Ramaswamy?
Yeah, so I listened to him on Andrew Schultz, one of the leading new media figures of the modern era. He wants to get rid of the Department of Education.
Yeah, so he's an idiot. Okay.
Okay, so why is that a bad policy?
Well, because one, broadly speaking, I think U.S. college level education is pretty successful. I think it's a huge driver of like better income earnings after graduation. We have elite universities that people from all over the world come to the United States to attend, and I haven't heard a single viable alternative suggested from any conservative that wants to eliminate the Department of Education.
Have you listened to any interviews with Vivek where he talks about this?
No. What is his alternative?
Well, again, I'd point out, like, don't call people so stupid until you've listened to their whole point. Because
Before we get into Vivek Ramaswamy talking about the Department of Education, in another interview, I don't know if it was the same one or not, Vivek Ramaswamy said that he would fire federal workers by looking at their social security numbers and firing anybody whose social security number ends in odd numbers. So he's just going to, just based on whether if you have an even number, you get to keep your job. If you have an odd number, you would lose your job. That's Vivek Ramaswamy's plan to cut federal workers. That is stupid.
Listen to it, and it sounds good to me, but I genuinely don't know enough to be like, I'd like to have Destiny listen to this and tell me what's fucking wrong.
I don't have time to listen to every single insane random person that has so I just don't have the time to do it.
Fair enough. Yeah.
What was his suggested alternative or whatever?
He says you can the Department of Education's original purpose was to stop schools in the South from siphoning money away from black school districts and putting it in white school districts. That was the original purpose of the Department of Education. Now, what the department does is, I think it's like on average,
hold on,
given school.
Wait a second.
Yeah.
The Department of Education, I'm fully admit, I could be totally wrong. The Department of Education is a federal level office that exists in the United States. Do they have impacts on funding for like elementary school and high school stuff?
According to Vivek, on average, 10% of a given public school, its funding comes from Department of Education.
Okay, 10%. But when you said a public school, is that colleges only, or is that also high school?
I think it's school. I think it's like K through 12. I don't know much. Okay. I don't know
Okay, so
Now the guy P.F. Young is correct about this, and Vivek Ramaswamy, if he said that, is correct. It is about 10% of the funding for K through 12 education comes from the Department of Education. So Destiny doesn't seem to exactly know what he's talking about here, because he seems to feel that the Department of Education is only involved in college education, whereas it is K through 12 education. One thing that is, just as an aside, is special education funding. Much of it comes from the Department of Education. So people who have kids in special education courses, and that's not going to fall along party lines. There would be a lot of people who are MAGA right-wingers and people living in red states are going to be very unhappy if funding is cut for special education programs that benefit their children. So that's going to be, if that happens, and if you live in a red state and they choose not to make up the difference in that funding, that's going to be really an F around and find out situation for some of these people.
10%. Okay, so I'm just. Do you want to listen to a thing for like 3 minutes? We could just listen to him talk about this. Somebody linked me. Okay, hold on. Can you hear this?
I want to know if I'm a fucking moron.
Can you sort of steel man the perspective of somebody that looks
Does this audio come through for you, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
at a particular Department of Education, and are saying that the amount of pain that will be caused by closing it and firing 75% of people will be too much?
Yeah, so I go back to this question of mission, right? A lot of people who make arguments for the Department of Education aren't aware why the Department of Education was created in the first place.
Okay, so I will say, firstly, no, we can evaluate the argument, or we can evaluate what he's saying later, whether it being true or false. But I will say, firstly, why a thing was created doesn't speak to the efficacy or help us evaluate what it is now, right? That we can imagine things that were created for a nefarious purpose that now serve a really good purpose, right?
Planned Parenthood, perfect example. It started by
if we believe, that it was made to kill black people, but we can imagine things that were created with a nefarious purpose in mind that are actually like incredibly beneficial now, right?
Indisputable fact about what's her name?
I don't.
Margaret Sanger.
Sure, no offense, but I don't trust any of the things you bring up without me reading them myself. But I don't know. But I'm just saying, regardless, it doesn't matter. Okay.
All right. Well.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I agree. Genetic fallacy. Right?
Sure. Okay.
Who make arguments for the Department of Education aren't aware why the Department of Education was created in the first place. Actually, so that might be a useful place to start. Is that this thing was created? It had a purpose, presumably. What was that purpose? Might be at least a relevant question to ask before we decide what are we doing with it or not. What was the purpose of this thing that we created? It's not it to me seems like a highly relevant question, yet in this discussion.
So it's not relevant. So the fact that he's saying this means that I already know where we're going, and I already know the counter argument that I would give, but we'll see if he gets there. So the fact that he's saying this is so important, and he wants to get rid of it, means he's probably going to have a historical origination for it that is going to sound in modern day morally abhorrent. But my question would be, okay, well, it was founded for this purpose that you're saying is bad. Does it still do that thing that we agreed today is bad? If it does, then maybe I would agree. If it doesn't, then why are you even bringing this up? And is it even a good argument? But we'll see where he goes. That would be where my mind is going to immediately. But we'll see what he says, okay?
About government reform. It's interesting how eager people are to skip over that question and just to talk about, okay, but we got the status quo and it's just going to be disruptive, versus asking the question of, okay, this institution was created. It had an original purpose. Is that purpose still relevant? Is this organization at all fulfilling that purpose today? To me, those are some relevant questions to ask. So let's talk about that for the Department of Education. Its purpose was relevant at that time, which was to make sure that localities, and particularly states, were not siphoning dollars, taxpayer dollars, away from predominantly black school districts to predominantly white ones. And that was not a theoretical concern at the time. It was happening, or there was at least some evidence that was happening in certain states in the South. And so you may say you don't like the federal solution, you may say you like the federal solution, but like it or not, that was the original purpose of the U.S. Department of Education, to make sure that from a federal perspective, states were not systematically disadvantaging black school districts over predominantly white ones. However noble and relevant that purpose may have been 6 decades ago, it's not a relevant purpose today. There's no evidence today of states intentionally mapping out which are the black versus white school districts and siphoning money in one direction versus another. To the contrary, one of the things we've learned is that the school districts in the inner city, many of which are predominantly black, actually spend more money per student than other school districts for a worse result as measured.
Okay, sorry. I don't know if critiquing the history is necessary or not. It's probably not.
Probably is not.
It's probably not. It seems like the Department of Education was created in 1867. It's not worth going. But okay, but we'll keep listening. Okay, we'll look for the argument. Okay.
Evidence today of states intentionally mapping out which are the black versus white school districts and siphoning money in one direction versus another. To the contrary, one of the things we've learned is that the school districts in the inner city, many of which are predominantly black, actually spend more money per student than other school districts for a worse result as measured by test scores and other performance on a per student basis, suggesting that there are other factors than the dollar expenditures per school determining student success, and actually suggesting that even the overfunding of some of those already poorly run schools rewards them for their actual bureaucratic failures.
Okay, that's just an unbelievable logical fallacy. I am familiar empirically with the idea that just throwing more money at things doesn't necessarily make those outcomes better when it comes to education. But there are other really basic, like statistical things that we can imagine are at play. So for instance, if I spend $10,000 on chemotherapy versus $1 million on chemotherapy, there might be very little difference in patient outcome, but that doesn't mean that I could just spend $0 on chemotherapy. There might be like thresholds at the top or bottom that significantly alter outcomes, number one. Number two, just because spending more money doesn't improve outcomes doesn't necessarily mean that when we spend more money, we're creating worse outcomes. Again, to go with the hospital example, my guess is the more money that you spend on a patient, probably the worse outcomes that patient has. But why? If I go to the hospital, they're probably spending what? $100 to take my wisdom tooth out, or $1,000 for a wisdom tooth extraction or whatever. But if I go in and I have like major surgery, that's probably way more expensive, but it's major surgery. I'm more likely to die. That's just one example of how what he's saying doesn't necessarily logically follow. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's wrong. He could go on to demonstrate why spending more money on a bureaucracy is like creating worse outcomes, but he needs to demonstrate that because what he said so far isn't a logical argument.
Destiny is correct with what he's saying here, and where these people like Vivek Ramaswamy are so disingenuous. Okay, there's more money being spent, if what he's saying is correct, there's more money being spent in predominantly black schools than other schools. Does he have a plan to do anything to actually fix that, if that's a real problem? All Vivek really talks about is cutting jobs, cutting government workers. His whole thing, the Doge program, all they talk about is cutting jobs. At least that's all they've talked about so far. So how would fewer teachers make things any better for black students? It would.
You agree with me so far?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Go on.
So against that backdrop, the Department of Education has instead extrapolated that original purpose of what was a racial equality purpose to instead implement a different vision of racial equity through the ideologies that they demand in the content of the curriculum that these public schools actually teach. So Department of Education funding.
So the federal government cannot dictate curriculums to school. So he might just be referring to colleges here. I'm not sure, but there is no federal national curriculum.
He gives an example of what he's talking about.
All right, we'll hear it.
I have listened to this clip.
Sure. Okay.
So federal funding accounts for about, giving you round numbers here, but around 10% of the funding of most public schools across the country. But that comes with strings attached. So in today's Department of Education, this didn't happen back in 1970, but it's happening today. Ironically, it's funny how these things change with the bureaucracies that fail. They blow smoke to cover up for their own failures.
Well, things could also just change because new problems arise in front of us and you have to confront and deal with, like the idea that the bureaucracies expand or the bureaucracies are dealing with different issues today than they did in the past. This obviously, yes, we have different issues today in the past, but whatever. All right.
What happens with today's?
Yeah, obviously what Destiny says here, things are going to be different now, and there would be different issues to face that, 100 years ago, there weren't computers in schools, So obviously there are going to be different things happening. We didn't have the internet and social media and all these other things. There were all kinds of careers that wouldn't have existed that people need to prepare for now. So this really gets into this idea of conservatism, where conserve is part of the word conservatism. They just want things to never change and to stay as they were 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Change is always bad, which is funny that, Vivek is in with all these tech bros and stuff. But conservatism is all about things never changing and staying as they are or as they were.
Department of Education. They effectively say you don't get that funding unless you adopt certain goals deemed at achieving racial or gender equity goals. And in fact, they also intervene in the curriculum where there's evidence of schools in the Midwest or in the Great Plains that have been denied funding because Department of Education funding, so long as they have certain subjects like archery. There was one instance of a school that had archery in its curriculum. I find that to be pretty interesting, actually. I think that...
Is he talking about Title IX stuff? I wish he... Okay, do I want to look at the specific example?
We don't...
Sorry, go ahead.
I mean...
Well, because
we don't have
hold
to.
on. Well, there are, because this is another issue that I have. I hate this guy so much. Thank you for reminding me. I hate this fucking guy so much. Things that he's saying are so broad that there are worlds where what he's saying could be so horrible, like, wow, this is a big problem. Or things where what he's saying are like, well, this is actually good. I like this. So for instance, what he's saying right now that like the federal government forces you to have certain equality things or whatever, and otherwise they'll pull your funding. Well, that could be a world where they're like, you have to teach critical race theory to first graders and tell them that they can be trans if they want to, right? And I'd be like, okay, well, this is really bad. But what if it's like,
Agreed.
but what if it's like Title IX stuff where it's like, if you've got sports teams for men, you need to have equivalent sports teams for women, or like you can't discriminate against, you can't have like race-based like adoption for students. You can't like say we want 10% black. Well, okay, I don't know if that's that bad. That's probably fine. We probably expect that from publicly funded things, right? So I would need more examples there. But it sounds like he's giving one about archery. Hold on.
Archery. There was one instance of a school that had archery in its curriculum. I find that to be pretty interesting, actually. I think you have different kinds of physical education. This is one that combines mental focus with physical aptitude. But hey, maybe I'm biased. Doesn't matter whether you like archery or not. I don't think it's the federal government's job to withhold funding from a school because they include something in their curriculum that the federal government deems inappropriate.
And this is the thing that the right-wingers are always going to do, like Vivek Ramaswamy. They're going to point out some bizarre example at one school somewhere that has archery instead of saying we need some federal guidelines because, what if some state just determines, we don't need to teach algebra. Our kids don't need that. They're never going to need algebra in their life. So they just say, we're not going to teach algebra. You need some guidelines in place so that kids across the country are learning similar things, and you don't have a kid on the West Coast who is learning, again, algebra as our example, and then that kid moves to the East Coast and he's never had an algebra class before, or she has never had an algebra class before, and is completely lost. I mean, that only makes sense. I don't want to play this entire thing. They actually have this conversation for 2 hours and almost 3 hours. But Vivek Ramaswamy, again, this whole goal here with all of these cuts that they want to make, it has nothing to do with being more efficient. It has nothing to do with getting rid of inefficiencies. It's just that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and these other people that donate to Republicans, and they donate to Democrats as well, they just want to have their taxes as low as possible. They don't want to have anything that benefits anyone who isn't a billionaire or a multimillionaire. And they want to siphon much of this money that's being used for education and other public goods for themselves. That's all that this is. So they are going to just cut jobs. They don't like federal workers. They don't like state workers. They don't like teachers. And they don't like anything that benefits normal people, anyone who isn't a multi-millionaire or a billionaire. That's it. They want all the tax money for themselves. We have Elon Musk, who's going to be partly in charge of this Doge thing with Vivek Ramaswamy, and much of what he has built is from government funding. He pulled him up by his bootstraps and blah, blah, blah. The government funding part never gets brought up. So let me know what you think about this, about Destiny breaking this down with Vivek Ramaswamy, about Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk's plans for all the cuts that they want to make. Do you think those will be beneficial? Will they not be beneficial? Let me know in the comments. Make sure to give me a like and subscribe if you haven't done so. It helps my channel to grow. This is Chris on Culture. I will see you in the next video.